The rhythmic, relentless crash of the Mediterranean against the jagged cliffs below was the first thing that anchored me to reality. It was a cold, lonely sound, echoing the hollow ache in my chest. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, trying to remember the smoke, the screeching tires, and the smell of burning rubber from the accident that should have ended my life. But here the air was different. It smelled of expensive ozone, clinical antiseptic, and a faint haunting trail of lilies. Steady, Rose. Do not rush the revelation. The voice was deep, smooth as aged whiskey, and utterly commanding. I felt long, cool fingers brush against my temple, beginning the slow, methodical task of unwrapping the gauze. With every loop of the bandage that fell away, I felt more exposed, as if he were peeling back my very soul. My skin felt tight, hypersensitive to the air of the air-conditioned suite. When the last layer fell, the silence in the room became heavy, suffocating. I opened my eyes. The sunlight pouring through the balcony windows was blinding, reflecting off the white silk sheets and the massive emerald ring that weighed down my left hand. Seo Jae-hyun stood before me, his athletic frame silhouetted against the ocean view. He didn't look like a doctor. In his fitted black suit, he looked like a god of the underworld. He didn't offer a smile. Instead, he reached for a small, silver-handled mirror on the nightstand and held it up. I gasped, the sound catching in a throat that felt like it had swallowed glass. The woman in the mirror wasn't Rose or Larson. The girl from the slums of Atlanta, with the faded scar on her chin and the tired eyes of a survivor, was gone. In her place was a masterpiece of surgical perfection. A face of ethereal beauty, with high porcelain cheekbones and wide, haunting eyes that I recognized from the framed photograph on the side table. "My wife is dead," Jae-hyun whispered. His intense gaze locked onto mine through the reflection. "And the world believes you died in that wreckage. From this moment on, Rose Larson no longer exists. You are the resurrection of Seo. You are my wife. And you will play your part perfectly, or you will find that the grave is a much lonelier place than this island." The mirror felt heavy in my hand, a silver-edged anchor pinning me to a reality that shouldn't exist. I stared at the reflection, tracing the unfamiliar curve of a jawline that was too elegant, the slope of a nose that was too straight, and eyes that held a depth of sorrow they hadn't possessed yesterday. This was the face of a woman who had been loved, envied, and ultimately destroyed. It was no longer the face of Rose Larson, the woman who had spent her life running through the shadows of Atlanta's backstreets. "Do you like her?" Jae-hyun's voice drifted from the balcony, cutting through the sterile silence of the suite. He didn't turn around. He remained a dark silhouette against the brilliant blue of the Tyrrhenian Sea, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture of absolute clinical detachment. "She's beautiful," I whispered, my voice sounding foreign even to my own ears, clearer, more melodic, as if the surgery had reached down into my vocal cords. "But she isn't me. Rose Larson died in a burning wreckage on the A1 highway 3 weeks ago," Jae-hyun said, finally turning to face me. He walked toward the bed with a predator's grace, each step deliberate. "The girl who was running from a debt she couldn't pay, the girl who had no one left to mourn her, she is gone. I didn't just save your life, Rose. I erased your failures." He stopped at the edge of the bed, looking down at me not with affection, but with the cold appraisal of a collector examining a restored artifact. He reached out, his thumb grazing the emerald ring on my finger. "This island is a ghost, Rose. My wife Minna was the heart of the Seo Empire. When she died, the vultures began to circle. My father's will is clear. The inheritance and the chairmanship only remain mine if my wife is by my side to sign the succession papers on the first anniversary of our marriage. That is in 6 months." I felt a chill that the silk pajamas couldn't ward off. "You want me to commit fraud. You want me to lie to the world." "I want you to live," he corrected, his voice dropping to a dangerous register. "The man you were running from? The one who caused that accident? I know his name. I know where he is. Outside of this island you are prey. Inside this skin under my name, you are the most powerful woman in Seoul." He leaned in closer, the scent of his expensive cologne, sandalwood and cold steel, filling my senses. "The price of your new face is simple. You will learn her walk. You will learn her history. You will learn to love me in public and tolerate me in private. You will be the perfect ghost. If you succeed, I will give you a new identity and enough money to disappear forever when the year is up. And if I fail? I asked, my heart hammering against my ribs. Jae-hyun stood up straight, his expression hardening into a mask of stone. If you fail, the people who killed the real Min-ah will realize their mistake. And I won't be there to pull you from the fire a second time. He turned and walked toward the door, leaving me alone with the crashing waves and the beautiful, dead stranger in the mirror. I looked down at the emerald, its green depths as cold and unforgiving as the man who had bought me. I was no longer a survivor, I was a replacement. And in this den of ghosts, I had to learn to haunt before I was hunted. The silence that followed Jae-hyun's departure was heavier than the bandages had been. I sat on the edge of the sprawling bed, the emerald green silk of my pajamas shimmering like oily water. Every time I caught my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling windows, I flinched. The woman staring back was a masterpiece of deception, a hauntingly beautiful shell that housed the frantic, terrified spirit of Rose Larson. A soft chime echoed through the room, and the heavy oak door swung open. A woman in a charcoal gray suit entered, her expression as sterile as the clinic walls. She placed a leather-bound folder on the mahogany vanity, right next to the framed photograph of the woman whose face I now wore. "Mr. Seo is waiting for your signature," she said, her voice devoid of warmth. "The terms are non-negotiable." I stood up, my legs still trembling slightly, and walked to the vanity. The document inside the folder was thick, ivory-toned, and smelled of expensive ink. The contract of the canary. That's what it felt like. A golden cage with bars made of legal clauses and non-disclosure agreements. I scanned the pages, my eyes catching on the numbers. $2 million upon the successful completion of the year. A total erasure of my debt in Atlanta. A new identity, complete with a clean passport and a background that couldn't be traced by the monsters I had left behind. In exchange, I was to surrender my name, my history, and my very identity. For the next 12 months, I was to breathe, speak, and act as Min-ah Seo. I was to be the dutiful wife, the corporate figurehead, and the silent partner in a game of shadows. "If I sign this," I whispered, looking at the woman in the charcoal suit, "what happens to Rose?" "Rose Larson is a ghost," she replied, handing me a heavy fountain pen. "And ghosts don't need money or safety. Only the living do." I looked back at the mirror. The emerald ring caught the light, casting a green glow across the porcelain skin of her hand. Jae-hyun was offering me the one thing I had never possessed. A future. But it was a future built on the bones of a dead woman. If I stayed as Rose, I was a marked woman with no escape. If I became Min-ah, I was a target in a much larger, much deadlier war. I thought of the car crash, the heat of the flames, and the feeling of the world closing in. I thought of the man Jae-hyun mentioned, the one who was still hunting for the girl from the slums. With a hand that finally stopped shaking, I pressed the pen to the paper. The ink bled into the page, dark and permanent. I signed the name Min-ah Seo in a graceful practice script I had yet to truly learn. The woman took the folder and bowed slightly. "Welcome home, Mrs. Seo. Your training begins at dawn." As the door clicked shut, I looked out at the ocean. The waves were still crashing against the cliffs, indifferent to the fact that Rose Larson had just been buried alive in a billionaire's clinic. I was a canary in a gilded cage, and the song I was about to sing was a lie that had to be perfect. Because if I hit even one wrong note, the cage wouldn't just stay locked, it would become my coffin. The training didn't feel like education, it felt like an exorcism. For 18 hours a day, the sun-drenched clinic suite was transformed into a theater of the macabre. Projectors cast flickering images of Min-ah Seo onto the pristine white walls, her ghost dancing over the furniture, her laughter echoing through speakers hidden in the ceiling. "Again," Jae-hyun commanded. His voice was a low rasp from the shadows of the corner where he sat, watching me with an intensity that made the fine hairs on my neck stand up. "The way she holds her wine glass. It isn't a grip, Rose. It's a caress." Min-ah never looked like she was trying to hold anything. She looked like the world belonged to her by divine right. I reached for the crystal flute on the vanity, my fingers trembling. I mimicked the delicate curve of her hand from the video playing on the wall. A gala in Seoul 3 years ago. In the footage, Min-ah was radiant, her smile a weapon of mass destruction. I caught my own reflection in the mirror, wearing the same expression, and a cold shiver raced down my spine. I was becoming a medium for a woman I had never met. Better, he murmured, suddenly appearing behind me. He didn't touch me, but the heat radiating from his body was a physical weight. He reached around and adjusted my wrist, his skin burning against mine. The contact was electric, a sharp contrast to the clinical coldness of our arrangement. For a fleeting second, his gaze dropped to my lips, and the air in the room seemed to vanish. The hatred and suspicion that usually defined his expression wavered, replaced by a raw, haunting longing that wasn't meant for me, but for the face I wore. I jerked my hand away, the spell breaking. "You're not looking at me," I snapped, my voice cracking. "You're looking at a memory. You want me to be a doll that breathes." Jae-hyun's eyes darkened, the ice returning to his features. "I want you to survive the first 5 minutes of the succession ceremony. If you trip over your own feet or speak with that Atlanta drawl, we are both dead. My family doesn't just have money, Rose, they have teeth. They will tear you apart if they smell the fraud." "Maybe they should," I retorted, pacing the room in the high heels that felt like torture devices. "Maybe it's easier to be dead than to be your pet ghost." He moved with a speed that caught me off guard, pinning me against the balcony door. The sound of the ocean roared behind the glass, matching the turbulence in his eyes. His hands were braced on either side of my head, trapping me in the scent of sandalwood and desperation. "You are not a ghost," he whispered, his face inches from mine. "A ghost doesn't have a pulse this fast. A ghost doesn't look at me with fire in her eyes." His gaze searched mine, and for the first time he wasn't looking at Minna's perfection. He was looking at the defiance of Rose Larson. The friction between us was no longer just about the lie. It was a spark of something dangerously real. He pulled back abruptly, his jaw tight. "Study the 2024 charity auction video. I want the tilt of her head perfected by dinner. Don't make me regret choosing you." He vanished into the hallway, leaving me breathless in the fading light. I turned back to the projection, watching the dead woman smile at the camera, and wondered if I was learning to wear her mask, or if the mask was beginning to swallow me whole. The helicopter blades cut through the humid Seoul air, a rhythmic thrumming that mimicked the frantic beat of my heart. Below us, the sprawling metropolis began to sparkle as twilight descended, but my focus was fixed on the man sitting across from me. Seo Jae-hyun was silent, his profile sharp against the glass, his eyes distant as if he were already mentally managing the chaos our arrival would trigger. As we touched down on the private helipad of the Seo estate, the transition from the island clinic to the real world felt like stepping onto a battlefield. This wasn't just a house. It was a fortress of glass, steel, and secrets nestled in the hills of Songbukdong. The doors opened, and a line of staff stood in perfect, terrifying formation. At the head was an elderly woman with silver hair pulled into a bun so tight it seemed to stretch her eyes. She was the head housekeeper, Mrs. Han, the woman Jae-hyun had warned me about, the one who had raised Minna. "Welcome home, madam," they said in unison, their voices a chilling chorus of rehearsed loyalty. I stepped onto the pavement, my heels clicking with a confidence I didn't feel. I wore a tailored cream suit, Minna's favorite color, and her signature scent, a blend of jasmine and expensive rain, clung to me like a second skin. As I walked past the line, I felt Mrs. Han's gaze. It wasn't the welcoming look of a servant. It was the piercing, analytical stare of a woman looking for a crack in the porcelain. I didn't look at her. I kept my chin tilted at the exact 15-degree angle Jae-hyun had drilled into me for 3 weeks. Entering the grand foyer was like walking into a shrine dedicated to my own replacement. Everywhere I looked, Minna was there. A massive oil painting dominated the main staircase, her eyes my eyes, tracking my every move with a haunting, knowing smile. Framed photographs lined the hallways. Minna at a charity gala, Minna cutting a ribbon, Minna laughing in the arms of a younger, softer version of Jae-hyun. The house was cold, filled with the silence of the dead. I stopped in front of a console table where a candid photo sat. In it, Minna was holding a small white lily, the same flower that now sat in a crystal vase beside the frame. My hand went to my throat, the phantom itch of the bandages returning. I felt like a thief who had broken into a life and forgotten to leave. "Your tea is served in the library, madam." "Just as you like it," Mrs. Han said, appearing suddenly at my elbow. Her voice was a low silk rasp. "Though you seem different, if I may say." The accident changed the way you carry your shoulders. The air in the room turned to ice. Jae-hyun's hand settled firmly on the small of my back. A gesture that looked like affection but felt like a warning. She has been through a trauma, Mrs. Han, Jae-hyun said, his voice cutting through the tension. I expect the household to respect her recovery. There will be no further comments on her appearance. He led me toward the library, his grip tightening just enough to ground me. As we passed the final portrait, I caught our reflection in the polished marble floor. We looked like the perfect power couple returning from a tragedy. But as I glanced back at Mrs. Han, I saw her narrowing her eyes at the way I walked. The island was over. I was in the lion's den now, and the ghosts of this house were already whispering that I didn't belong. The dining room of the Seo estate felt more like an operating theater than a place for a meal. The long obsidian table was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the cold, calculating faces of the 5 men who held the reins of the conglomerate's most powerful subsidiaries. These were the men who had spent the last year betting on Minna's death and Jae-hyun's downfall. I sat at the head of the table opposite Jae-hyun, the weight of the emerald ring feeling like a lead shackle. My dress was a structured sapphire silk that clung to my skin, mirroring the icy composure I had spent weeks rehearsing. Every time I lifted my fork or tilted my head, I felt their eyes, sharp as scalpels, dissecting me for any sign of the trauma Jae-hyun had used to explain my absence. It is a miracle, is it not? Director Park remarked, his voice like dry parchment. He leaned forward, his gaze fixated on the faint, expertly hidden surgical line near my hairline. To survive a crash of that magnitude and return with such renewed vigor, one might almost say you look like a different woman, Minna. The table went silent. The only sound was the muffled roar of the wind against the reinforced glass windows. Jae-hyun didn't move, but the air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. I felt a bead of sweat prickle against my spine, but I didn't blink. I remembered the video from the 2024 auction, the way Minna looked at people she considered beneath her. Different, director? I asked, my voice a calm, melodic hum that betrayed nothing of the Rose Larson screaming inside. I set my crystal glass down with a precise, silent touch. Or perhaps you've simply forgotten that a Seo doesn't break easily. If you find my vigor surprising, perhaps you've spent too much time looking at my obituary, and not enough time looking at the quarterly reports. Jae-hyun's eyes flickered toward mine. A brief electric flash of approval that sent a jolt through me. Minna has been focused on her recovery, Jae-hyun added smoothly, his hand moving to cover mine on the table. His skin was warm, a grounding force in the sea of sharks. But she hasn't lost her edge. As we move toward the succession ceremony, her presence is a reminder that the Seo family is whole. The test intensified as the third course arrived. They peppered me with questions about old rivalries, specific art acquisitions from years ago, and personal grievances Minna had nurtured like poisonous flowers. Each question was a landmine. I navigated them by using the Minna silence. A slow, condescending blink followed by a vague but cutting remark that forced them to fill in the blanks. One slip-up, one misremembered name, and the invisible hand Jae-hyun warned me about would know exactly who I was. The stakes weren't just the inheritance anymore. It was the realization that these men wouldn't just expose me. They would dispose of me the moment the front door closed. As the dinner ended, Director Park stood, bowing with a stiff, unsatisfied smile. A remarkable recovery indeed, Mrs. Seo. I look forward to seeing you at the ceremony. It will be the ultimate proof of your authenticity. He left and the others followed like shadows. When the heavy doors finally clicked shut, the mask I had been wearing shattered. I slumped in the chair, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Jae-hyun stood and walked over, placing a hand on my shoulder. This time it wasn't for show. You passed, he whispered, his voice dark and strained. But the wolves are no longer just hungry, Rose. Now they're suspicious. The adrenaline from the dinner had faded, leaving behind a cold, hollow exhaustion that seeped into my bones. Jae-hyun had retreated to his study, leaving me alone in the master suite. A room that felt less like a sanctuary and more like a museum of Minna's life. Every object was a reminder of the woman I was pretending to be, from the crystal perfume bottles to the silk robes hanging in the closet like discarded skins. I couldn't sleep. The silence of the mansion was too loud, filled with the imagined whispers of the staff and the judging eyes of the portraits. I began to pace, my bare feet sinking into the thick Persian rugs. Restlessness led me to the vanity, and then to the small, hidden compartment behind the velvet-lined jewelry drawer that Jae-hyun hadn't mentioned during our training. My fingers brushed a catch, and a narrow panel clicked open. Tucked inside was a small leather-bound book, its cover stained and worn at the edges. It was a diary. I sat on the edge of the bed, the heavy emerald ring catching the dim lamplight as I turned the pages. The handwriting was elegant but increasingly erratic, the ink smudged in places as if by tears or haste. I started from the final entries, dated only days before the crash. "He thinks I don't know," the first entry read. "He thinks his silence is a shield, but I can feel the eyes on me even when I am alone in this house. The threats aren't coming from the rivals outside. They are coming from within the circle. Someone is tampering with the car's telemetry. Someone wants the seat at the table, and they realize I am the only thing keeping Jae-hyun grounded." My breath hitched. I flipped the page, my heart hammering against my ribs. The brakes felt soft today. I told the mechanic, but he looked through me as if I were already a ghost. "If something happens to me, Jae-hyun will be blamed. That is the plan. To take the empire, they must first take the heart. I am not a wife anymore. I am a liability. If you are reading this, Jae-hyun, look at the board. Look at the men who smile the widest. The emerald I wear is a curse, a target painted in green." The book slipped from my hands, thudding onto the rug. The accident that had left me broken and Rose Larson dead hadn't been an act of fate. It had been a cold-blooded execution. The woman whose face I wore had known she was being hunted. She had lived in this house, walked these halls, and worn this very ring while knowing that someone she shared tea with was planning her murder. I looked at the emerald on my finger. The deep, dark green suddenly looked like a pool of stagnant water, hiding secrets that were now my own. I wasn't just a replacement for a dead wife. I was a replacement for a victim. Jae-hyun hadn't just bought me a new face. He had placed me directly in the crosshairs of a killer who thought their job was finished. If the invisible hand realized that the woman in the sapphire dress tonight wasn't a miracle, but a decoy, they wouldn't stop at a car crash this time. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the dark Seoul skyline. The city looked beautiful and indifferent. I realized then that the contract I signed wasn't just for a year of my life. It was a death warrant. I wasn't a canary in a gilded cage. I was the bait in a trap that had already snapped shut once. And the worst part? I was starting to realize that Jae-hyun might be using me to catch a killer, even if it meant I had to die to do it. The diary remained hidden beneath my pillow, a paper ghost haunting my sleep, but the morning brought a threat far more visceral. Jae-hyun had insisted on a public recovery walk, a carefully staged appearance at a high-end gallery in Gangnam to quell the rumors sparked by the dinner. I moved through the space like a porcelain doll, my hand tucked into the crook of Jae-hyun's arm, projecting the serene, untouchable aura of Seo. I was discussing the brushwork of a contemporary minimalist piece with the curator when the world glitched. "Rose? Rose Larson." The voice was a jagged blade, cutting through the polished silence of the gallery. It wasn't melodic or refined. It was thick with the grit of the life I had supposedly left behind in the wreckage. I froze, the champagne flute in my hand trembling just enough to catch the light. Beside me, I felt Jae-hyun's muscles tighten into steel. Standing near the sculpture of a weeping willow was a man I recognized instantly. Benny, a low-level runner for the very people I was hiding from. He looked out of place in his scuffed leather jacket and desperate eyes, staring at me with a mix of confusion and terrifying hope. "It is you," he breathed, stepping forward. "The news said you were dead, but I'd know those eyes anywhere. Rose, you have to come back. They think you stole the—" "I beg your pardon?" I interrupted, my voice coming out as a cold, aristocratic crystalline shimmer. I didn't turn my head fully, mimicking the haughty dismissal I had practiced for hours in front of the island mirrors. "Do I know you, young man?" Jae-hyun stepped in front of me, his shadow swallowing Benny whole. The air around them turned lethal. "You are distressing my wife," Jae-hyun said, his voice a low, predatory growl. "Security. Wife," Benny stammered, his eyes darting from my flawless, unfamiliar face to the emerald ring that cost more than the block we grew up on. "No, look at her. That's Rose. She's got a debt man, a big one. Two burly men in black suits appeared from the periphery, seizing Benny by the arms. As they dragged him toward the exit, he kept screaming my name, my real name, into the hollow air of the gallery. The elite patrons turned their heads, their whispers rising like a swarm of locusts. My heart was a trapped bird battering against my ribs. The mask felt like it was melting. I could feel the sweat pooling at the nape of my neck, right where the surgical scars were still tender. If Benny had seen through the perfection, how many others would? Jae-hyun didn't let go of my arm. He leaned in, his lips brushing my ear in a gesture that looked like a private comfort to the onlookers, but his words were ice. Do not break character, Rose. Not even for a second. If you look back at him, you confirm everything he said. He knows, I whispered, my lips barely moving. Jae-hyun, they're here. They followed me. Then we move faster, he replied, his gaze scanning the room for other threats. Smile, Minna. The cameras are watching. I forced my lips into the practiced, enigmatic curve of a woman who had never known hunger or fear. But as I looked at my reflection in a nearby glass installation, I didn't see the billionaire's wife. I saw a girl from Atlanta playing dress-up in a dead woman's clothes, while the hounds of her past finally caught the scent of the blood beneath the perfume. The grand ballroom of the Seo estate was a sea of shifting shadows and gilded masks. Orchestral music swelled, weaving through the scent of expensive champagne and the hushed whispers of Seoul's elite. I moved through the crowd in a gown of shimmering silver, my face obscured by a delicate lace mask that felt more like a shield than a costume. Beside me, Jae-hyun was a phantom in black, his own mask a stark obsidian that made his intense gaze even more piercing. Stay close, he murmured, his hand a firm, grounding weight on the small of my back. The invisible hand doesn't just watch from the sidelines. They dance. Tonight was the ultimate waltz of deception. Every bow, every practiced laugh, every tilt of my head was a calculated move to draw out the person who had tried to bury Minna. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic rhythm that clashed with the slow tempo of the violins. Every masked figure that brushed past us felt like a potential assassin. Every polite greeting felt like a trap. Dance with me, Jae-hyun commanded, leading me toward the center of the floor. As we moved, the world blurred into a swirl of light and fabric. For a moment, the deception felt dangerously real. The way he held me, the heat of his palm against mine, and the focused intensity in his eyes made me forget I was a replacement. I wasn't Rose Larson from the slums, and I wasn't the dead Minna. I was something else, something caught in the gravity of a man who looked at me as if I were the only fixed point in a spinning world. The moment was shattered by a sharp, cold prick against my shoulder. It was so subtle I almost missed it. A brush of a passing dancer, a gloved hand that lingered a second too long. But then, a spreading numbness began to creep down my arm. My vision flickered, the gold leaf on the ceiling suddenly dripping like melting wax. Jae-hyun, I breathed, my knees buckling. He caught me instantly, his arms turning into iron bands. Rose? What is it? Someone, my shoulder. My voice was a slur. I looked over his shoulder, my gaze colliding with a masked figure retreating into the shadows of the garden terrace. They were wearing a simple, nondescript mask, but they paused for a heartbeat, looking back with a chilling, predatory stillness. In that look, there was no confusion, only the cold satisfaction of a hunter who believed they had finally finished a lingering job. They're here, I whispered, the darkness closing in around the edges of my sight. Jae-hyun didn't waste time with questions. He swept me into his arms, his face a mask of controlled fury that far surpassed the obsidian lace he wore. The ballroom blurred as he carried me toward the private wing, his pace a lethal stride. The killer had made their move, convinced they had finally poisoned the billionaire's wife. They didn't realize they had just pricked a survivor, who was no longer willing to play the victim. As the world faded to black, my last thought wasn't of the pain or the poison. It was the realization that in trying to kill Minna a second time, they had finally forced Rose Larson to wake up and fight back. The safe house was a stark, brutalist concrete structure hidden deep in the mountains of Gangwon-do, a far cry from the gilded cage of the Seo estate. The air inside smelled of pine and copper, the sharp metallic scent of blood. Jae-hyun sat on a low leather bench, his black suit jacket discarded on the floor like a wounded shadow. His dress shirt was ruined, the white fabric soaked crimson where a bullet had grazed his side during our frantic escape from the masquerade. "Sit still," I commanded, my voice steadier than my hands. I had found a medical kit in the galley, and the familiar routine of cleaning a wound, a skill learned in the gutters of Atlanta, brought a strange grounding clarity to the chaos. Jae-hyun hissed as the antiseptic touched his skin. The terrifying, untouchable billionaire was gone. In his place was a man, pale and sweating, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might shatter. "You shouldn't know how to do this," he rasped, his eyes hooded with pain. Minna would have fainted at the sight of a needle. "Minna isn't here," I said, my eyes meeting his. I leaned in to apply the bandage, my face inches from the sharp line of his throat. "Only Rose. And Rose has seen worse than this for a lot less money." As I worked, the silence of the mountains pressed in around us. The adrenaline that had sustained us was leaching away, leaving behind a raw, dangerous vulnerability. Jae-hyun leaned his head back against the cold concrete wall, his eyes closing. "I didn't choose you just for your height or your bone structure, Rose," he whispered. His voice was hollow, stripped of its usual armor. "I chose you because when I saw your file, I saw someone who refused to stay dead. Minna. She was the only person who saw me before the title, before the empire. When she was killed, they didn't just want the money. They wanted to erase the only part of me that was human." I paused, the adhesive tape in my hand. "You're using me as a weapon." "I'm using you as a mirror," he corrected, opening his eyes. They were bloodshot and filled with a haunting, jagged grief. "To show them that they failed. To make them believe she's back long enough for me to find the one who pulled the trigger. But tonight." He reached out, his hand trembling as he touched my cheek, his thumb tracing the line where the bandages had once been. "Tonight, when I saw you falling, I didn't see a ghost. I didn't see a replacement. I saw you." The air between us charged with a sudden, suffocating heat. The friction that had been building since the island clinic, the sparks of defiance and forced intimacy, finally caught fire. It wasn't the polished, practiced romance of the Seo family portraits. It was something desperate and primal, born from the shared trauma of two people who were tired of living among the dead. "You're bleeding again," I whispered, though I didn't move away. "Let it bleed," he groaned, his hand sliding into my hair, pulling me closer until I could feel the erratic beat of his heart against my own. Behind the suit, behind the cold brilliance and the ruthless reputation, was a man who was just as broken as the girl he had plucked from the wreckage. In that dim, concrete room, the lie felt further away than ever. I wasn't just a replacement anymore, and he wasn't just my owner. We were two survivors clinging to each other in the dark, waiting for the wolves to return. The mountain air biting through the open windows of the safe house was the only warning I had before the silence shattered. Jae-hyun was still in the galley, his movement heavy and sluggish from the fever that had begun to take hold of his wounded side. I was standing by the stone fireplace, clutching a cold cup of coffee, when the front door didn't just open, it disintegrated. The shadow that stepped through the dust wasn't a faceless assassin or a masked dancer. It was Director Park. He stood there without his suit jacket, his shirt sleeves rolled up, looking less like a corporate titan and more like a man who had spent his life burying bodies in the foundations of skyscrapers. In his hand, he held a suppressed pistol that looked terrifyingly efficient. "I have to admit, Jae-hyun found a masterpiece in you," Park said, his voice a dry, rattling sound. He didn't look at my face. He looked at my hands, which were trembling. "But the way you bandaged him earlier. Minna couldn't tie a shoelace, let alone a field dressing. You have the hands of a girl who has lived in the dirt." "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, retreating toward the kitchen island, my mind racing through the wife etiquette Jae-hyun had drilled into me. "Maintain eye contact. Keep the chin level. Never show fear. Drop the act, Rose," Park spat, the name hitting me like a physical blow. "I knew the moment you spoke at dinner. Minna was a bitch, but she was a predictable one. You have the eyes of a stray dog that's tired of being kicked." He raised the gun, his finger tightening on the trigger. In that split second, the polished sapphire-clad shell of the billionaire's wife cracked and fell away. I didn't reach for a witty retort or a graceful plea. I reached for the heavy, cast-iron skillet sitting on the stove behind me. As Park fired, the phut of the suppressed round thudding into the cabinetry, I didn't scream. I dived. I rolled across the hard slate floor, a move born of dodging debt collectors in the alleys of Atlanta, not ballroom dancing. I came up swinging. The skillet connected with his wrist with a sickening crack, sending the gun skittering across the floor. Park roared, reaching for me with his good hand, his face contorted in a mask of primal rage. He expected me to cower. He expected a victim. Instead, I drove my heel into his knee and followed it with a jagged, desperate strike to his throat with the edge of my hand. This wasn't the refined combat Jae-hyun had tried to teach me. This was the frantic, ugly survival of a woman who refused to be erased. We crashed into the glass coffee table, shards of expensive crystal slicing into my skin, but I didn't let go. I scrambled for a jagged piece of the broken glass, pressing it against his jugular just as Jae-hyun appeared in the doorway, swaying, his own weapon raised. "Stop," Jae-hyun rasped, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. The shattered glass, the fallen director, and me breathing hard, covered in blood that wasn't mine. I looked up at Jae-hyun, the lace of my expensive sleeve torn and my perfect hair matted with sweat. The mask was gone. The unmasking was complete. I wasn't the replacement anymore. I was the girl from the wreckage, and I was the most dangerous thing in the room. He killed her. I wheezed, my grip on the glass tightening. He's the one. Park looked up at me, the fear finally reflecting in his eyes. He realized too late that he hadn't been hunting a ghost. He had been hunting a survivor. The dust from Director Park's arrest had settled, and with it, the suffocating shadow of the invisible hand had finally lifted from the Seo estate. The succession ceremony had passed that afternoon. A whirlwind of flashing cameras, stiff handshakes, and the final heavy stroke of a pen that secured Jae-hyun's empire. I had stood by his side, the perfect resurrection of Mina Seo, performing the role so flawlessly that even the most cynical board members bowed their heads in submission. Now the mahogany vanity in the master suite held two items that didn't belong together. A thick envelope stuffed with untraceable cash and a new, pristine passport in the name of Alara Vance, and the leather-bound diary of a dead woman. "The jet is ready," Jae-hyun said from the doorway. He wasn't wearing his suit jacket. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, and he looked more like the man from the safe house than the titan of industry. "The accounts have been cleared. You can go anywhere. Zurich, London, back to the States. Rose Larson is officially, legally, and permanently gone." I picked up the passport, the cool plastic feeling heavy in my palm. This was the finish line. This was the clean slate I had been running toward since the wreckage on the highway. I could go back to being a ghost, but this time a wealthy one. I wouldn't have to look over my shoulder. I wouldn't have to wear someone else's face. But as I looked at the passport, I realized I didn't recognize the woman it promised I could be. "Is this what you want?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. I turned to face him, the emerald ring catching the dim evening light. "For the contract to end here?" Jae-hyun stepped into the room, the distance between us suddenly feeling like a vast, uncrossable canyon. "I promised you freedom, Rose. I promised you that once the inheritance was secured, you wouldn't have to play the part anymore. I'm a man of my word." "Freedom," I repeated, the word tasting like ash. I looked at the framed photos of Minna that still lined the walls. For weeks I've been obsessed with not being her. I hated the clothes, the scent, the mask. But tonight downstairs, when they called me Mrs. Seo, I wasn't thinking about the lie. I was thinking about the way you looked at me when the cameras weren't watching. I walked toward him, stopping close enough to feel the heat radiating from his chest. The life I had before was a series of narrow escapes and cold rooms. The life you're offering me in that envelope is just a different kind of hiding. I spent my whole life trying to survive, Jae-hyun. But with you, even in the middle of a war, I felt like I was finally living. Jae-hyun's hand reached out, his fingers trembling as they grazed my jawline. The jawline he had paid to shape, but the skin that belonged only to me. "If you stay," he rasped, his eyes dark with a longing that no longer had anything to do with a dead woman. "You won't be a replacement. I won't let you be a shadow. But the world will always see her face. Let them see whatever they want," I said, reaching up to cover his hand with mine. I took the emerald ring off my finger and set it on the vanity, next to the passport. I don't want to be her. And I don't want to be the girl who ran away. I want to be the woman who stayed. The choice was made not in a boardroom or a clinic, but in the quiet of a room full of ghosts. I didn't want the exit strategy. I wanted the man who had seen the fire in Rose Larson's eyes and decided it was worth more than a billionaire's legacy. He pulled me into him, his kiss a desperate, silent vow, and for the first time since the crash, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I was home. The fireplace in the master suite crackled, the orange flames licking at the cold air of the room. It was the same hearth where I had once stood trembling, wondering if I would survive the night. Now it served a different purpose. I stood before it, the heavy leather folder containing the contract of the canary gripped in my hands. Beside me, Jae-hyun watched, his presence no longer a shadow that loomed over me, but a tether that held me close. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice low and thick with an emotion that no longer needed to be hidden behind corporate steel. "Once this is gone, there is no exit strategy. No Alara Vance. No clean slate in Zurich. You will be tied to me, to this name, and to the targets that come with it." I looked down at the document. It was a masterpiece of legal binding, a tether to a version of myself that was born from desperation. Then I looked at the man beside me, the man who had bled for me, who had seen the girl from the dirt, and called her his equal. "I'm not looking for an exit anymore, Jae-hyun," I said, my voice steady. "I spent my whole life running toward a ghost of a future. I'd rather stay here and build something real." I tossed the folder into the heart of the fire. We watched in silence as the flames curled around the edges of the ivory paper, blackening the signatures and turning the million-dollar clauses into drifting ash. The debt, the indenture, the lie. It all vanished in a plume of smoke. When the last page crumbled, the weight that had been pressing against my chest for months finally lifted. Jae-hyun reached into his pocket and pulled out the emerald ring. It sparked with a predatory green light, the symbol of the Seo matriarch. He took my hand, but he didn't slide it onto my finger immediately. He held my gaze, his thumb tracing the knuckles of the hand that had fought off an assassin. "Minna wore this as a shield," he whispered. "She wore it because she was born to it. But you earned it. You took a dead woman's life and made it thrive. You aren't her replacement, Rose. You are the reason this empire still stands." He slid the ring into place. It felt different this time, not like a shackle but like a crown. "The board is waiting," he said, offering his arm. "They think they're coming to a victory lap for the succession. They think they're meeting the wife who survived an accident." I tucked my hand into the crook of his arm, my silk sleeves rustling against his suit. I caught my reflection in the floor-to-ceiling mirror one last time. The face was still the same, the porcelain perfection, the haunting eyes, but the spirit behind it had changed. The replacement was dead. "Let them think what they want," I replied, my chin tilting upward with a natural lethal grace. "They're not meeting a survivor today. They're meeting their queen." We walked out of the suite and toward the grand staircase, our shadows merging into one on the marble floors. Downstairs, the doors to the ballroom swung open, revealing a sea of people ready to bow to a ghost. I didn't hesitate. I stepped into the light, finally home, finally seen, and finally more than just a shadow in a billionaire's world.